This was very stimulating and very different from your previous presentation. So it was also a lot of new information for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Marjorie.
Yes. Here I am.
Hey, okay, brief introduction, and then we get into for most of us, a very difficult poem. Marjorie Perloff is, let me make it very short because I could spend 1 hour reading your bio. Is emerita at Stanford University. She's also emerita at the University of Southern California. She's the author of many books and articles on 20th and 21st century poetry and poetics. And most recently, I wrote down the two more, Infrathene, an experiment in micropoetics, and the first English edition of Wittgenstein's private notebooks. That was almost the topic of your talk, but then we decided to go for T.S. Eliot. Okay, I'll let you talk, and then I have my own questions, and I'm sure the audience will have questions.
Thank you. Very happy to be here. This will be very different from the two amazing technological talks you've heard. We're now going back in time, and this would be quite old-fashioned because I decided, except for the poem itself, I'm not going to show you a lot of photographs of T.S. Eliot and that sort of thing. Seemed like a waste of time. So we're going to get right into this amazing poem. Okay, do you see it?
Yes.
Is it on there? Yeah. Okay. You have the poem in front of you. The Wasteland is probably the most famous 20th century poem, certainly in English. And it is a difficult poem, but it wouldn't need to be that difficult. But what's so interesting is, why is it so famous? It has 440 lines. It's a long poem. It's a collage, which means that things are pasted together that don't really seem to fit together. And it isn't straightforward. And even today, poetry has become very old-fashioned again and confessional and sing-songy, and you get straightforward little love poems and little perceptions and so on. Whereas The Wasteland includes many different languages: Latin, Greek, Italian from Dante, French, and it ends with Sanskrit, as you'll see. And so often people get very scared of it and say, well, why should I read this? And I don't know these languages. And what is it all about? Well, I think the reason it's still very relevant is the language is some of the most beautiful language we have, and the most memorable phrases. Many of them have become titles of novels, and we'll see that as we go along. I can't in 20 minutes go through the whole poem with you, but we're going to hit some highlights and talk about how this poem basically works, because it does have, as we go through, I want you to think that it does have a unified theme, which is that after World War I, when Eliot wrote it, beginning in about 1920. The war ended in 1918, and T.S. Eliot was an American poet from St. Louis, Missouri, but from a very sort of New England upper-class family, who came to England to study philosophy. And because of the war, he got stuck in England and he couldn't go back home. And at first he hated that idea of living in England and being at Oxford. And then he had been very fond of, I think myself in love with, a young man named Jean Verdinal, whom he had met in France, and was killed in the war. And the collected poems are dedicated to Jean Verdinal, mort aux Dardanelles, died in the Dardanelles. And on the rebound, maybe from that relationship, Eliot married, it's become a very famous marriage, Vivian Heightley, and it was a terrible marriage, sort of hell for both of them. She adds a few lines to The Wasteland. And Eliot did live in his own private wasteland, but the word was that the poem is really about the human condition after World War I, the feeling of loss of all ideals, a world that nobody really understood anymore, didn't know what to do. And it does create that mood, although Eliot himself said, all I wanted it to be was some rhythmic grumbling. That's all it really was. Well, that's of course exaggerated, but it is of course based on his own private hell, and yet it brings in so much of other worlds from Dante, from Homer, from Shakespeare, that everybody can relate to it in some way. And there've been very good performances of it by different poets. I don't usually like actors performing poetry, but in this case, they've been quite interesting. The poem is dedicated, you see here, for Ezra Pound, Il Miglior Fabbro, in Italian, the better craftsman. And that's because Eliot was in a mental hospital when he wrote a great deal of it. He had a kind of breakdown, and it is a kind of study of breakdown. And Pound, Ezra Pound, a very different kind of poet, but his great friend, fixed it up. He took it, crossed out most of it, and he did some amazing things that I still think are just wonderful. For instance, you see right here, Unreal City, under the brown fog of a winter dawn. The original line read something like, Unreal City, I can sometimes see and see. And Pound just crossed that out. And he said, Unreal City is enough. You don't need all that. Or here, when we come to when this passage that begins, when Lil's husband got demobbed, originally the line was, when Lil's husband was dismissed from the transport corps, and Pound just crossed that out and put in that one word, demobbed. He said, you don't need all that verbiage. So Pound's correction of the wasteland, which is in a separate book, which has become famous, is like, could be used as an exercise in poetry classes in how to write. That is how to be intense, concise, not have so much verbiage, and get rid of all that extra stuff. So, and the other very funny things that, for instance, when Eliot had said, the hot water and a closed car at 4, and originally he had carriage, and Pound put in the margin, we're in 1914, you know, or 18, you don't need carriage, they're cars now, we don't have carriages. And he also got rid of the word perhaps and put in the margin, damn perhapsy. Either you know or you don't know, you don't need perhaps. So it's that kind of correction. And without Pound, it would have been a very different and not as good poem. So that's why it's dedicated to Pound. And it starts with the famous lines, April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the deadland, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. And that is, of course, the antithesis of what we think of as spring. April is supposed to be the season of renewal, spring. And he was thinking of Chaucer, who started the Canterbury Tales with, when that Aprili with his sorrows sowed, when April comes is when we want to go on pilgrimages and everything starts, flowers bloom. But here it's just the opposite. In this deadland, April is the cruelest month. And you have all those participles, breeding, mixing, stirring, dull roots with spring rain. And I want you to notice the rhythm. One of the great things of the wasteland is the rhythm. It's written in free verse, but free verse can mean many things. And the basic line here throughout is often a 4-stress line, 4 stresses per line, like dull roots with spring rain, varied in various ways, but very powerful. And so you get that image of a reversal, and then you get a scene, a little scene, and Eliot does this kind of thing all the time. Summer surprised us coming over the Starnberger See. You don't have to know where the Starnberger See is, exactly where it is, with a shower of rain. We stopped in the colonnade and went on in sunlight into the Hofgarten and drank coffee and talked for an hour. And then you get some German. Bin gar keine Russin, stamme aus Litauen, echt Deutsch, which means I'm not Russian. I come from Lithuania. I'm a true German. And what Eliot is satirizing there is the notion that of somebody saying I'm a true German, which was, you know, Germans were supposed to be a pure race and not Russian, but I come from Lithuania. And that was probably, and this is one of Eliot's great shortcomings, an anti-Semitic remark, because Lithuania was a very Jewish country, and she's trying to be something she isn't. But he's trying to just present here fear, and I'll explain why in a minute. And when we were children, staying at the Archduke's, my cousins, he took me out on a sled, and I was frightened. He said, Marie, Marie, hold on tight. And down we went. In the mountains, there you feel free. I read much of the night and go south in the winter. So a very dark picture of a kind of an inability to sleep, insomnia. You have to go to the mountains to feel free. This was based on a book by somebody Eliot knew, a Countess Marie, who he got this from, but he put all this together to get the feeling, because the basic theme of the poem, and I want you to watch this now as we go along, is that without faith in God, Eliot was quite religious, without faith of some kind in something higher than human beings, life is just death. And on the other hand, death can be life-giving. That's the basic paradox that animates the entire poem. Without faith, life is death. Life is just a wasteland. And he's presenting here these society types who hang around and sit around in some hotel and stop in the colonnade and have coffee and talk for an hour, but have no real identity, and there's no meaning in their lives. And that's what pretty much you'll see the whole poem is about. There is also a central figure that goes more or less through, who is the poet himself, but he doesn't speak in his own person. This poem is very much objectified. In other words, instead of saying, as lesser poets do, I feel bad, I feel awful, my life is a mess, etc., etc. Eliot always presents it objectively by giving you images and pictures and other things that you can identify with. So, and he will change moods, but that basic theme will always continue. So he now switches to a kind of biblical movement, and you'll recognize Ezekiel and Isaiah and so on. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images, where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and so on. So there's that tone of, again, the stony rubbish is the wasteland. There's no rain. There's no life-giving water. Everything is dried up, the kind of drought, and all we really have is a heap of broken images. And of course, the whole poem could be looked at as a heap of broken images. And it goes on in that vein. I'm going to skip over a little bit now. There's a fortune-telling incident that comes up now with Madame Sosostris, famous clairvoyante, had a bad cold, nevertheless is known to be the wisest woman in Europe, with a wicked pack of cards. And you get here the tarot cards, and in a way this predicts the entire poem. Nothing in this poem is wasted. It may look as if it doesn't fit in, but it always does. Here said she is your card, the drowned Phoenician sailor. In a way, the poet is himself, the drowned Phoenician sailor. Those are pearls that were his eyes. There is a possibility of transformation that refers to Shakespeare's The Tempest. Those are pearls that were his eyes. And then every woman in the poem is pretty much belladonna, the lady of the rocks. Notice rocks again, dry rock, the lady of situations. And then we have the one-eyed merchant, which who will come up again, and the hanged man. Now you can say the hanged man is a prototype of Christ. It's also vegetation rituals. It's never meant to be clear or be just one thing. Fear death by water. Now, death by water would actually be life-giving, because what's needed in the wasteland, which is totally dry, is water, the life-giving waters. I see crowds of people walking around in a ring. Thank you. If you see dear Mrs. Equitone, tell her I bring the horoscope myself. One must be so careful these days. And so that silly passage about people playing with the tarot pack, telling their fortune, really does tell the fortune of what is to come in the poem. And then comes a famous passage that rounds out this first part, the burial of the dead. Unreal city, under the brown fog of a winter dawn. You see those heavy stresses again? Under the brown fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge. So many, I had not thought death had undone so many. That line comes from Dante when the pilgrim first comes into hell and sees the people being ferried over into hell. And he said, I had not thought death had undone so many. Sighs short and infrequent were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet, flowed up the hill and down King William Street, to where St. Mary Woolnoth kept the hours, with a dead sound on the final stroke of 9, and so on. Notice Eliot always mixes real places, King William Street, the Church of St. Mary Woolnoth, with a kind of almost surreal image of what life is. And because we're going to be short on time, I'm going to move on now to the second part, which I think will interest you. And this is pretty straightforward. The second part is called A Game of Chess, and there are two women. There's the rich lady and a kind of low working class woman. And both of them are, let's say, representatives of what life in the wasteland is like. The first one is based on Shakespeare's description of Cleopatra, the beautiful Cleopatra, the barge she sat on, like a burnished throne, burned on the water. But here, it's all artificial. She has perfumes. She's looking in the mirror. And above her mirror, there is displayed a painting of, if you look down a few lines, the change of Philomel by the barbarous king, so rudely forced, the story, the terrible story of how Tereus had Philomela would have revealed what had happened to her sister, the nightingale, and so he removed her tongue. And that's a terrible myth, again, of loss, withered stumps of time. And still she cried, and still the world pursues. Jug, jug to dirty ears. Now, and then as this is going on, somebody comes up the stairs, and let's read through this. My nerves are bad tonight. Yes, bad. Stay with me. Speak to me. Why do you never speak? Speak. What are you thinking of? What thinking? What? I never know what you are thinking. Think. I think we're in Rat's Alley, where the dead men lost their bones. What is that noise? The wind under the door. What is that noise now? What is the wind doing? Nothing again, nothing. Do you know nothing? Do you see nothing? Do you remember nothing? I remember those are pearls that were his eyes. It's that line again. Are you alive or not? Is there nothing in your head? But oh, that Shakespearean rag. It's so elegant, so intelligent. What shall I do now? What shall I do? I shall rush out as I am and walk the street with my hair down so. What shall we do tomorrow? What shall we ever do? The hot water at 10, and if it rains, a closed car at 4, and we shall play a game of chess, pressing lidless eyes and waiting for a knock upon the door. Now, remember that in 1922, when this was written, as I say, most poetry, lyric poetry, had a central speaker, the poet, meditating on love poetry in pretty straightforward language, nature imagery. Nobody had ever written a poem like this before. It was a complete anomaly, more like a play, and very dramatic. And the image of that neurotic woman who has nothing to do, who was based, by the way, on his wife, Vivian, and she put in the margins, in her own handwriting, what you get married for if you don't want children. That was her addition to all this. Sexual sterility is a big theme throughout the poem. Sexual sterility as the symbol of spiritual sterility. So you have that woman, and by the way, there really was a dance called the Shakespearean rag. It was part of American rag music. It's so elegant, so intelligent, but all that idea of what shall I do? What shall I ever do? So that is the rich lady. And then you get the contrast, and Eliot was brilliant at doing this. And the refrain here, I'm going to read it, but I want you to watch the refrain, hurry up, please, it's time, which has two meanings. It's the bartender closing the pub. Hurry up, please, it's time, last call, time to go home, no more drinks. And it also is from the prophets, Isaiah saying, I, the Lord, will find you. Hurry up, please, it's time. It is time to meet your God. So now watch how this works. And this is written in a kind of Cockney dialogue, a London dialogue. Anyway, when Lil's husband got demobbed, I said, I didn't mince my words. I said to her myself, hurry up, please, it's time. Now Albert's coming back. Make yourself a bit smart, coming home from the war, that is. Now Albert's coming back. Make yourself a bit smart. He'll want to know what you've done with the money he gave you to get yourself some teeth. He did. I was there. You have them all out, Lil, and get a nice set, he said. I swear I can't bear to look at you. And no more can I said. And think of poor Albert. He's been in the army 4 years. He wants a good time. And if you don't give it to him, there's others will, I said. Oh, is there, she said. Something of that, I said. Then I'll know who to thank, she said, and give me a straight look. Hurry up, please, it's time. If you don't like it, you can get on with it, I said. Others can pick and choose if you can't. But if Albert makes off, it won't be for lack of telling. You ought to be ashamed, I said, to look so antique, and her only 31. I can't help it, she said, pulling a long face. It's them pills I took to bring it off, she said. Abortion pills, evidently. She's had 5 already and nearly died of young George. The chemist said it would be all right, but I've never been the same. You are a proper fool, I said. Well, if Albert won't leave you alone, there it is, I said. What you get married for if you don't want children? Hurry up, please, it's time. Well, that Sunday Albert was home. They had a hot gammon, a ham, and they asked me into dinner to get the beauty of it hot. Hurry up, please, it's time. Hurry up, please, it's time. Good night, Bill. Good night, Lou. Good night, May. Good night. Ta-ta. Good night. Good night, ladies. Good night. Sweet ladies. Good night. Good night. And those last words are the words of Ophelia in Hamlet when she goes mad in the mad scene. Good night, ladies. Good night, sweet ladies. I don't know how much more time I have, do I, Piero?
No, keep going, keep going.
Can I keep going a little bit? Okay.
Yes,
Because
yes.
I mean, it's really hard to get through it. Now, the fire sermon, the third section, is one of the most important, and again, gives you the landscape, the rat creeping by, the testimony of summer night, twit, twit, jug, jug, so rudely forced, an unreal city comes back. Unreal city, under the brown fog of a winter noon, Mr. Eugenides, there's the one-eyed merchant from the Tarot Pack, the Smyrna merchant, unshaven, with a pocket full of currants. CIF London documents its site, asked me in demotic French to luncheon at the Cannon Street Hotel, followed by a weekend at the Metropole. So some kind of unsorted overture. And then Tiresias comes on the scene and the typist, but I'm going to skip over this now because I want to look really at the last part. At the end of part 3, there is a sense that maybe things will get better, that everything doesn't need to be this mood of despair. You have the various Thames daughters on Market Sands. I can connect nothing with nothing. The broken fingernails of dirty hands. My people, humble people who expect nothing. But then you get the line, to Carthage, then I came, which comes from St. Augustine. And wonderful. In the Confessions of St. Augustine, which I'm sure some of you have read, I hope, you get the part where Augustine realizes he's just all the lustful things he's been doing. To Carthage, then I came, the city of unholy lust, burning, 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 burning. Oh Lord, thou pluckest me out. Oh Lord, thou pluckest, burning. And that is the Buddha's fire sermon. So there is the idea here that there may be purification in order and after death by water too. But what I want to look at with you in the remaining few minutes is what the thunder said. That's the last section, and the section that Pound changed very little, and where there seems to be some kind of renewal possible. After the torchlight red on sweaty faces, after the frosty silence in the gardens, after the agony in stony places, the shouting and the crying, prison and palace and reverberations of thunder of spring over distant mountains, he who was living is now dead. You see how the life-death paradox comes in. We who were living are now dying, with a little patience. And then you get again the rocky, sterile landscape, the rock, the sound over rock, the session that nothing may help, the session of despair, and finally falling towers and the different cities, Jerusalem, Athens, Alexandria, Vienna, London, and the word unreal comes back. And again, a woman comes back, but then there seems to be a damp gust bringing rain. And now the last part of it is going to use Sanskrit. Now, why Sanskrit? You know, Eliot didn't really know Sanskrit. He'd studied a little bit, but he loved the idea of this very foreign language. And the three things, dayadam, which will come up in a minute, and dayamya mean give, sympathize, and control. And you'll see Ganga was sunken. Ganga is just the Ganges River. Ganga was sunken, and the limp leaves waited for rain, while the black clouds gathered far distant over Himavant, the Himalayas. The jungle crouched, humped in silence, then spoke the thunder, Da. And now comes the great question the poet has to ask himself. Data, what have we given? My friend, blood shaking my heart, the awful daring of a moment's surrender, which an age of prudence can never retract. By this and this only we have existed. Now, these have become very famous lines. I say it gives us all kinds of titles of novels, An Age of Prudence and so forth. What does he mean? The awful daring, all I've ever been able to do is for a moment get out of my old dead self and be something else. The awful daring of a moment's surrender, a moment of love, which an age of prudence can never retract. We're living in this age of prudence. By this and this only we have existed. That's the only living thing we have, which is not to be found in our obituaries or in memories draped by the beneficent spider. empty rooms. So give, and then comes diatom, meaning sympathize. I have heard the key turn in the door once and turn once only. We think of the key, each in his prison. Thinking of the key, each confirms a prison. Only at nightfall, ethereal rumors revive for a moment, a broken Coriolanus. Now, the key and the idea of being stuck in a tower with the door closing comes from Dante, one of the lowest circles of hell, the lowest circle where Ugolino is punished for having been an evil counselor. It's like the trials of Trump right now. And he hears the key term, which means he's locked in, and he ends up starving and eating his own son. It's a terrible scene. But then now we get the change. Damyata, give, sympathize, control. Damyata, the boat responded gaily to the hand expert with sail and oar. The sea was calm. Your heart would have responded gaily when invited, beating obedient to controlling hands. Now, are the controlling hands those of God, of Christ, who, or of a lover? It's not quite clear, but the idea that there would be the possibility on this calm sea for a new life. And so now you get, again, famous lines, I sat upon the shore fishing with the arid plain behind me. Throughout, the poet is represented as a fisherman. Fisherman, the idea of the fisherman bringing up a new world, the idea of vegetation myths, which goes through the poem. And so now you get a collage of all these fragments, maybe too fragmentary, but it's very striking because you get the line, shall I at least set my lands in order? Shall I at least set my lands in order? And that's usually considered, okay, the moment where Eliot felt he could get out of the wasteland, the poet can get out of the wasteland and come to something new. London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down, little poem. And then Poesascosa nel foco che riaffina, which is again in Dante, Arno Daniel in Purgatory, going into the purgatorial fire and coming out of it on the other side. And the swallow in the next part in Latin, the swallow that saves the nightingale, apart from Nerval, you don't need to necessarily know all those things. And finally, these fragments I have shored against my ruins. The whole poem has been those fragments that the poet has shored against his ruins. And then he takes a line from a 16th century tragedy with Hieronymo, why then I'll fit you, I'll supply you. And then come those three words again, data, diata, damyata, give, sympathize, control. And finally, shanti, 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 which Eliot says means roughly the peace that passes understanding. So the poem does lead out of the wasteland and into hope for a future world. And the whole thing is rendered, and you don't necessarily need to know every reference because the mood comes across very much anyway. The whole thing is rendered in terms of images, allusions, foreign tags, very dense collage, but the language is so tight and the rhythm is always very striking, like these fragments I have shored against my ruins. That became, you'll see that quoted everywhere. Now that you've seen The Wasteland, if you've never read it, you will find that everything you pick up, journalism, newspaper things, so forth, you'll find some reference to it because it is that famous. And many of these lines became so famous as a poem about despair and a certain resolution of despair, rendered in terms of a very objective picture of the wasteland of 1922. And now in 2022, again, I think I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Fantastic. You did a really, really good job in 25 minutes, whatever.
It's really hard. Yeah. That's big. Yeah.
So unfortunately for you, I have a full page of notes now, of questions. But let me start with telling the audience, because now as you were speaking, I remember something. Professor Perloff featured in a few of the entitled opinions. I think it's entitled opinions.stanford.edu that were run by Professor Robert Harrison. And I don't remember who the other poets were, but if you go there, you can find some other interesting discussions on poetry.
Pound, Yeats.
Yeats, right. And okay, so first question. Now, how do ignorant people like me read this poem? Well, there's actually a simple answer. Eliot himself wrote notes for us to read the poem. So my first question is, was this common? I mean, who else has done this before, to write a 400-line poem and provide the notes?
The only reason he actually provided the notes, I'm sorry, I should have said that, was because it was too short to make up a book. He wanted it published as a separate book to make some money. Eliot had no money. He was working at Lloyd's Bank in London, and he really wanted this to make some money. And so the publisher, who was Liverite, who was actually my publisher right down here, the publisher, Liverite in New York, I said, well, it's too short. You have to add something. You want to add a few other poems? And he didn't want to. He wanted to add Garantion. Then Pound said, no, that won't work. So he said, all right, I'll write some notes. So that gave him about 2 or 3 more pages. And the notes are kind of pretentious in a way. The hermit thrush, he'll tell you what a hermit thrush is in Latin, that kind of thing. And the notes, of course, caused a lot of trouble because everybody said, well, this is so pedantic. Poetry isn't supposed to have this kind of thing, right? But on the other hand, that's because we have today, let me say this, we have today a completely false notion of poetry. Poetry right now is at a kind of low point. I hate to say it, but it is. There's not very much good poetry being written because poetry is sort of considered like a craft. You know, it's considered what teenagers do when they're lonely or something like that. I heard of Michelle Obama say once, I used to write poetry when I was a teenager. In other words, people think of poetry as something you do, you know, when you have nothing, maybe, you know, to express your feelings, and it's so moving, and maybe, but why was it going to move anybody else? And they don't really have the craft or the skill. And after all, earlier on, poems, I won't say they had notes, but there were poems like Coleridge's The Ancient Mariner, which did have marginal notes and all kinds of things, and you did have to have a lot of knowledge. Now, you can say it's very irritating in some way for Eliot to put in some of these notes that nobody's going to know. I happen to know the German because German is my native language, and I know French. And I do know some Italian, but I don't know Sanskrit. And you know, you can't expect anybody to really get all these references. And so today it's in the Norton anthology. There's just now, and I have an essay in it. A new edition just came out by Michael North, who's at UCLA, a friend of mine. I have an essay in here in Garantion on the wasteland. And so when the poem is printed, it's always, you know, there are endless notes with it. All the notes go with it, explaining some of the things I've explained. But I don't think you need to know all those things necessarily. And the main thing is to start out and get some feel for it. And then, yes, if you spend a little time looking up what the references are. I mean, Eliot still lived at a time where he thought everybody knows Shakespeare. Everybody's going to recognize The Tempest. Everybody's going to recognize Antony and Cleopatra. Well, of course, today you can't expect that. The biblical references people today don't recognize. In fact, I'm not sure which references they would recognize. Despite that, though, the wasteland continues to be incredibly popular. So there's obviously something in it that makes people see it, even if they don't know the references. And then you spend some time and you look up the references. So when you said, how will I read it? Well, you will read it in an edition that has the Norton right online. You can get an edition if you just go online that has all the notes right next to it, but that sort of stops you in your tracks. But you read it first through, and then you look up the things that interest you, and you have to think it takes just as much time as reading a novel. You know, you would spend that kind of time on reading a novel. So the mistaken notion is to think that a poem is something that you just read through, you know, that just 5 minutes or whatever. That isn't really the case, and at least it wasn't then. And so it's true that this is a difficult poem, and the more interesting question is also, it's the last poem Eliot wrote this way. When he wrote the next poem, big poem he wrote was Ash Wednesday. That was straightforward. It had no illusions. It didn't have that many images. It was liturgical. It was sort of religious. For my taste, maybe a little too religious, but it no longer had these things. And so he gave up using that many illusions. The poet who did use that many foreign allusions was Ezra Pound in the cantos that are full of that, but they're kind of wonderful. You know, they're funny often and so on.
I like to put things in a historical and cultural perspective. So Wasteland comes out in 1922. World War I just ended. You mentioned that he had indirectly, he had, I mean, yes, this very good friend of his died in 1915, I don't remember, during the war. Where is the World War I in the poem? And now that we went through COVID and we were reminded of the Spanish,
yes.
where were these big tragedies? I mean, these were tragedies that killed millions of people.
Exactly. And it really isn't a war poem. That's a very good question. So glad you asked that. What you can say is it's a post-war poem, and it's not about the flu either. For Eliot, what the war was something that broke down the structure of Europe. And of course it did. And what he didn't like is that all these people were now turning up in the colonnade, like Marie, Bin Gakane Rusin and all that. So Eliot felt it was no longer where England, after all, England had been he was living in, by this time he was feeling he lived in England the rest of his life and started using English accent and becoming a sort of more English than the English, loving that world in a way. But England, which had its empire, its huge empire, even though it won the war, that was really the end of the empire pretty much. It wasn't long after that India was going to fall, that the empire, that it was going to lose its empire, that the world was going to change. And when he means the values were gone, he of course means Christian values, which most of his contemporaries wouldn't have necessarily believed, but everybody was pretty disillusioned. Why? Because, and I have written about this in my book, The Edge of Irony, from the Austrian point of view, World War I was, to me, the tragic war, even worse than World War II or any other war, because it was completely pointless. There was no reason for it. Why was there a war? Well, the Archduke was killed in Serbia. So then the Austrians went to war with the Serbs, and the Russians came to help the Serbs. And because it was a treaty whereby the English, had to be on the other side of the Russians and the Austrians. Next thing you know, all of Europe was at war, and more people were killed than, and this was still a war. Don't forget, everybody went. Every young man went. They had to go, and they died or they came back wounded and maimed, crippled forever. And for what? For what? What was the point of it? I mean, Germany wanted more Lebensraum, wanted more, didn't have an empire and wanted more, but in fact, it's hard to know. And by the way, if you're in Europe and you go to the trench museums, which are fascinating, especially in Belgium at Ypres, where they have the various museums that show you what trench warfare was like, you couldn't really win trench warfare. One side won one day, one side won the next day. It was a filthy form of war, a disgusting form of war, the worst possible. And Eliot had many friends who did die. Now, he doesn't talk about that at all here, but there were many of the poets and artists of the First World War, including the sculptor Gaudier Jerska, killed at the age of 23 in World War I. There were many that were killed, others who were wounded. The world was never the same again, but the main thing was, what was this all about? What for? How can we let that many people die for nothing? But Eliot felt it had come about because the countries, the imperialist nations, all they cared about was power, imperial power, and this sort of was the war was the outcome of it. I recommend to anybody who's very interested in that, Karl Kraus from the other side, from the Austro-Hungarian side, Karl Kraus's great play, The Last Days of Mankind, and that's how he regarded the war from the beginning, spoke about it from the beginning. Now, Eliot didn't really talk about the war. There were so-called war poets in London, Wilfred Owen, Rupert Brooke in England, who wrote about actually being in the trenches, a little bit sentimental. I don't like the war poets so much. I think Eliot is much greater because that's just it. He didn't make it just, oh, the war is so terrible poem. He gave it much larger ramifications. He wanted to treat it in that way so that the war's only on the sidelines when you see the cities and you have not reference to bombing, but you do have reference to death all the time, and death by bombing, and death was very much on his mind. And then came the Spanish flu, much worse even than our pandemic, that killed off even more people, so that life was just very precarious. And the big question was, what is life? Now, very frankly, I had hoped that with the pandemic, we would also start to ask those questions, but I don't think so. It's not having that effect.
Yeah. And by the way, in 1922, another thing that happened was Mussolini. Mussolini seized power in 1922, fascism. And by the way, Eliot, for being somebody who pretended to be apolitical, he wrote a lengthy essay on fascism a few years later, right?
Yeah, and his politics were terrible. I mean, often people will say later, how can you stand Eliot? He was anti-Semitic. He wanted royalism. I mean, he wasn't really, he wasn't quite a fascist, but he was not totally unfriendly to it either. So his own politics were not good. We just have to excuse that in some ways, because somehow or other he did manage to get beyond that and bring something very important, into this poem, because he had such a great sense of language. I want to say that for me, poetry is language. That's what poetry is. It's a certain use of language. And so Eliot had that.
His mentor Pound had much worse politics. So by comparison, Eliot wasn't that. Pound, yeah, Ezra Pound became a fascist. And
yeah, that too. And in general, well, look, Yeats had very bad politics. In the First World War, as opposed to the Second, most of the poets, why? Because they had a great fear of bourgeoisie. They had a great fear of the middle class. They wanted themselves not to be middle class. They wanted somehow to be elitist, as writers, and they couldn't be anymore, because in a populist world, who is the artist? How important is the poet? How important can poets still be? And look at our own time, where that's come even more so. Today, nobody would consider it, very important. This was still a time where people really discussed it. Although, by the way, The Wasteland had a very bad reception. When it was published, it was mostly panned in all the newspapers that said it was no good, and it was incomprehensible and much too difficult and private and all that. But the funny thing is, within a few years, it became very popular, very popular.
Okay, that brings me to the other big thing that happened in 1922, the publication of James Joyce's Ulysses. Now, I'm not aware of anything that Joyce said about Eliot, but Eliot wrote about Joyce's Ulysses, right? So
right.
What was the relationship there?
I think actually they were not so different. I don't think Joyce didn't really know Eliot, but he knew Pound very well. Pound is the connecting link between them, and Yeats also to an extent. But they have in common, Eliot's essay on Pound is about making a whole myth and structure, and how novels now have to have a new structure. You can't write novels anymore that are straightforward and just have a narrative and a plot. So you have in Ulysses, the Odyssey provides the entire structure for the poem, and there are all kinds of other structure from Thomas Aquinas, from everything else, big structures. And Eliot praised that. He thought it was a great novel, and it's not so different from The Wasteland, because again, there are all kinds of allusions. There's Latin, there's Greek, they're all everything, beginning with Stephen Dedalus in the very beginning, and the idea of Daedalus and Icarus, that myth, and the idea that you come back to foundational myths and they can organize your experience in ways that you couldn't otherwise. In other words, the whole idea is to get away, say, from the Victorians, who would still write straightforwardly and tell you just what they think, and write straightforward kind of tum-to-dum sing-song poems like Browning, spelling it out. And so there was the idea that modernism must be difficult, it must be indirect, it must be special, it must be a kind of secret language in a way, purposely, a kind of secret language. But then the aficionados are those that will know a secret language. And before you know it, The Wasteland was translated into French, translated into Italian, of course, very big in Italy, and so forth. So that's interesting. Mussolini, Pound admired Mussolini and went to see him one time and thought Mussolini wasn't really very interested in him, though. It didn't work both ways. But why Mussolini? Because he wanted some kind of statesman who would care about poetry. Because, and that was especially true in the United States. In the United States, this is a democratic country. People never cared much about poetry. I mean, yes, it's a recreation, it's entertainment, but it's not serious. It doesn't really matter. And I think maybe World War I was the turning point after which maybe poetry didn't matter anymore in the same way. You get it later in the century in Beckett, somebody like Samuel Beckett, who realizes that to the larger public, it just doesn't matter. And what do we do about that? I was thinking that just hearing the wonderful art talk before, because look at all this art based on science. But then, of course, my question about that is, what makes it art, really? In other words, will people still look at that art 10 years from now? I don't know. I don't know what you think about that. And does that matter? Does it matter? Is it just art for the moment? And if so, is that art? Isn't art something that lasts? Isn't art something that survives, the ages? And will computer art, or will these things last? And that's just a question in my mind about, although I like conceptual art very much, I'm interested in it. And these were wonderful examples. But this was still a time where poetry meant language, but it meant a different use of language and returning to the tradition and bringing the tradition to play. And Eliot did assume that most readers would know what the tradition was, so they would recognize a lot of the references.
One more aspect that maybe literary critics don't appreciate much. Jazz was in its infancy. I think the first, if I remember correctly, the first jazz record that dates from 1917. But anybody who listens to jazz thinks jazz as improvisation, syncopation, and quotation. And now if I read The Wasteland with that background, I grew up listening to jazz, rock, and
that's a great comment.
Right? That's The Wasteland.
Jazz plays a part, absolutely. And the Shakespearean rag. Eliot loved to go in London to the nightclubs and hear jazz. That was one of his favorite things. But of course, the irony is that is improvisation, and this is very calculated. In a way, it's very calculated. You can't just change things, and you can't improvise. But people have, over the years, they've used The Wasteland and used parts of it, put it together with other things, use jazz. You can do all kinds of things with the material. Go online and you'll see. The very first one who did that in terms of literature, not music, was Evelyn Waugh, who in I think it's Brideshead Revisited, the movie too. You can see the series on Netflix. In Brideshead Revisited, the Oxford young man stands on a balcony and he imitates. He goes, "And I, Tiresias, have foreseen all," and sort of acts out the wasteland. That's very funny, but it's been used that way. Yeah. So that's a very good point. I'm glad you mentioned that.
And what about the visual arts? At one point, you used the word collage. Well, collage, I mean, in the visual arts, collage. Even before Picasso, was it right?
Right.
And then Anna Hawke, of course, photomontage. So what was the relationship? I mean, was Eliot into by the way, there was the age of, I don't know exactly the timeline, but Impressionism, Cubism, Suprematism. So Picasso, Duchamp, Malevich,
absolutely.
Chirico, right?
And Eliot does fit in with those. Of course, he's a little late, 1922. Picasso did the first collages in 1912. But he did know through Pound, he knew Picasso's work, and it's exactly the same principle. The Cubist principle, it's instead of having a narrative, then this happened, you put things together simultaneously so the time becomes one time. Everything exists at the same time. And the things contradict each other. It's just like here, when you get, I read much of the night and go south in the winter, and then suddenly, what are the roots that clutch? You can paste in things and they seem different, but the juxtapositions create new meanings. And that's exactly what visual collage, of course, was the collage. In my book, The Future's Moment, I have a chapter called Collage at the very beginning where I talk about those relationships.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, and finally, since you liked my question about jazz, let me be a little bolder. What about music hall variety?
Yes, absolutely, the variety theater.
Right? A musical show as
Marinetti. He went in many times in London to see, both to hear Marinetti and to go to the music hall. And he loved these music hall things. He went all the time, whenever he could. That was one of his, and there's a lot of things written on that. And even when he was young in St. Louis, he tried to go to various events of that kind. So that was actually his predilection. And also, breaking up the pentameter, that was a big thing. I mean, most of English poetry, Romantic poetry, is written in iambic pentameter, 10 syllables, 5 stresses per line. It's almost Milton Paradise Lost is written in iambic, in blank verse is unrhymed iambic pentameter. Eliot doesn't use, he really gets away from the iambic pentameter so that you get this 4 stress written. April is the cruelest month breeding, but then other lines longer, shorter, and seeing what you can do with rhythm in poetry and getting away from those fixed rhythms. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, I could spend the rest of the evening discussing more things, but I'm sure we abuse of your time. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. And audience, if you want to hear more from Professor Perloff, just go on YouTube, just browse and check Entitled, I think it's Entitled Opinions, just one word, Entitled Opinions.
But there are a lot of other things, on YouTube, yeah. Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Excellent. And thank you, Laura. Thank you, Victor, if you're still there. This was a very intense but very pleasant evening and I'm sure the audience enjoyed. Thank you very
Got it.
much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.